مساء الخير عليكم جميعا. هذه الندوة هتكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وإنما أدعو أي من الحضور يريد الحصول على سماعة للترجمة الحصول عليها الآن حتى يكون متاح لكم جميعا مع بداية الجلسة وبداية حديث المتحدث الرئيسي. Okay, let me repeat that in English. And my name is Nabil Fahmy. I'm the Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And it's a personal honor and a pleasure to host you all here this evening for what I am sure will be a very interesting and stimulating talk. This is part of the Tahrir Dialogue series. It's a special event. It's done in conjunction with the Faculty of Political Science and Economics at the Cairo University, and Dr. Heba Abu Zaid is here representing the dean of that school. But it's also special because we've been able to host, in conjunction with the Slovenian embassy here, a very prominent political figure who's not only prominent in his own domain, in his own country, but also has had a very distinguished international role. He's also a candidate for the Secretary General of the United Nations, and that makes him a particularly interesting person for us here in Egypt. Egypt has been, as you all know, a very prominent supporter of the UN over the years, and I think we should, and I'm sure we will be, supporters in the years to come. Dr. Danilo Turk is former president of Slovenia. He's also been the former Assistant Secretary General of the UN for Political Affairs. He's an expert and an activist on human rights issues and humanitarian issues, has been an expert on several UN committees dealing with issues of discrimination against minorities, the prevention of discrimination against minorities, and he has published a large number of articles and books in this area. He has honored us today to come and speak to us about his vision of the global environment and what the UN can and or should do in the years to come, and I look forward very much to listening to his comments. My colleague, faculty member Scott MacLeod, who's also up here today, after introducing the distinguished speaker, will then, once the talk is concluded, manage the question and answer session with the speaker. I encourage you to comment briefly, but feel free to comment. Feel free also to ask questions so we can take advantage of our guest and really enjoy the evening, and also allow what's said and discussed to be distributed through the media to the larger Egyptian community. Thank you all for being here. Scott, do you want to take charge of this? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Fahmy. Well, it's a great honor to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to welcome President Danilo Turk of Slovenia, former president, who, as Dean Fahmy mentioned, is a candidate also for the Secretary General of the United Nations. Also like to emphasize, as Dean Fahmy mentioned, that Dr. Turk has a long record in defending and supporting and advocating human rights in the world. Just a couple of items of his CV, and then I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Turk. Before he served as president of Slovenia, the third president from 2007 to 2012, he did serve as the country's first UN ambassador from 1992 to 2000. And then during that period, he served as the president of the UN Security Council on 2 occasions. And following that period, from 2000 to 2005, he served as the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs under Secretary General Kofi Annan. I mentioned that he has a long history and record of defending human rights, which in Egypt here we appreciate very much. He wrote the chapter on human rights, or the section on human rights in the Slovenian Constitution. He has served as the UN Rapporteur on freedom of expression, and really it's almost countless works that you've contributed over, I think, a 30 or 40-year period in this field, which we appreciate. And you're also the president of a foundation that you started that supports and rehabilitates children who are affected by war. And I believe many of those children have come from Gaza to Slovenia to receive that kind of support. So without further ado, I would like to say again, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Turk.
Thank you very much for this warm welcome and this very nice introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here in Cairo again, a place which is known for political creativity and great support to the United Nations, a place of one of the Secretaries General of the United Nations, Dr. Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who was closely associated with this university. I'd like to tell you that when I presented my credentials to Dr. Boutros-Ghali back in 1992 as the first Slovenian ambassador to the United Nations, I told him in our brief conversation that I was teaching international law. And he said, "Oh, international law, this is very good. This helps you discipline your mind." So that's how I discovered his affection for discipline, for organization, for clarity of ideas, and for vision, of course, which has to be disciplined, not just fantasizing. And I have very fond memories of our conversations, which were not that many, but a few. And I think that he has contributed a great deal to what we now have in the United Nations. I mean, many of his ideas, which were explained in his famous reports, the Agenda for Peace, Agenda for Development, Agenda for Democracy, could not be carried out immediately. They were long-term, long-life ideas, and many found implementation later. But I think that it is only fitting for me on this occasion to recall how important his work was, how important it was to have a person of his erudition and knowledge and discipline at the time when the expectations for the UN were very high following the end of Cold War. That was a period of time when, of course, it was much more welcome to come with the new ideas than in some other phases of the United Nations history. And today, I am prepared to speak, to offer an introduction with a title which you have seen and which suggests the reference to the resilience of the United Nations in the time of a changing global order. Now, I intend to speak not more than 30 minutes, but I do expect that you will have your comments, because one of the reasons why I'm here, it's also to learn from you, to hear your views, and of course to try to answer your questions. And I understand that the concept of Tahrir dialogue is precisely that, so I would encourage you to comment my views, make your comments on my views, and I'm looking forward to your questions as well. Now, on the subject, I would like to say that this title that I suggested may sound somewhat optimistic. We live at a time of a variety of crises, some of which with a profound effect on international peace and security. And when the crises are piling, then the overall impression is that the world is in a very bad shape and that our future is not guaranteed. And in such situations, usually eyes turn towards the United Nations, and very often that turning of the eyes towards the United Nations is accompanied by very severe criticism, the criticism of alleged inefficiency, inadequacy, insufficiency of the United Nations. But I would like to propose that this skeptical view, which is completely understandable, has to be put in a proper temporal perspective, and that one has to look at the United Nations in its totality, not only in a selection of issues which are characterizing the moment in which we live and which characterizes also the situation of the United Nations. Now, the United Nations organization was established more than 70 years ago, and it was established with an optimistic message, a message of expectation of collective management of global security issues. And since this is an American university, I would say that it has a definitive stamp of American optimism. Optimism is not naivety. Optimism expresses a will to do things, to change the world, to improve the world. And therefore, I think that that optimistic note has to be properly understood. It is very well enshrined in the UN Charter and has been represented in much of what the UN has been doing. And over time, many positive changes have emerged as a result of that optimistic vision. Now, obviously, at the same time, UN has been always exposed to criticism and doubt. I was told by a very senior official of the UN, retired of course, who told me that the first article in New York Times which predicted demise of the United Nations was published back in 1947 at the time of the Iranian crisis, and some people believe that that's the end of the UN. Now, of course, that was not the end. UN was able to survive. And the question which we can put to ourselves now, 70 years and more after the creation of the UN, what is the reason for resilience? Why was the organization able to continue? And what constitutes a permanent core which would guide the organization into the future? I think that a larger historic look at the United Nations would tell us that the resilience of the organization is a result of three reasons. First, the inclusiveness of the organization. Second, its institutional stability. And third, a reasonably good level of its ability to reform. And let me make a few comments on each of these three reasons. First, I believe inclusiveness. It is very important that the organization was designed from start to be an inclusive organization, which would include both the major powers of our era and all nations of our era. Furthermore, inclusiveness is not only related to the membership, but also to the mandate of the organization. So the organization is always mandated to look at whatever comes as a new problem of international community. So inclusiveness is really a very important value enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and has been served well over time because the membership has grown. The permanent members of the Security Council have remained engaged in the UN with varying degrees, of course, of commitment. But the problems that the League of Nations, the predecessor, had with changing composition of the Council of the League did not emerge and did not weaken the organization. Furthermore, the Charter and its practice created a unique type of international legitimacy, because organization which is inclusive, which is almost universal, necessarily gains in legitimacy. Now, legitimacy of the UN does not only come from the Charter and from the international law which was produced by the United Nations, but also from its inclusiveness. An important practical effect of that is a unique convening power of the United Nations. The United Nations is capable of convening states and other actors on a variety of major issues of today, practically all major issues. I remember very well the year 2005 at the time of tsunami, which affected dramatically several countries in Asia and also in Africa. At that time, there was a big shock for the entire world, and the question is who can convene all the actors who needed to be present in an effort to help the people and to restore a degree of normalcy. And it was quickly discovered that although different actors had different priorities and different advantages, humanitarian organizations, the states, people and institutions who could provide money, and of course the American military, which had to be involved in this reconstruction effort. But only the UN was able to convene all these actors into a relatively coherent program, which proved to be relatively effective. As you know, former President Clinton was asked to serve as the coordinator, and he helped a lot. But it had to be done under the UN auspices. Now, I think that for the future, UN can expect expansion, both in terms of its universality and inclusion, in terms of membership, and in terms of substantive tasks. In this connection, I would like to make a reference to something that may sound alien to what I have been discussing so far. When I say that UN is inclusive, I would also like to emphasize that UN does not have, in any aspects of its work, exclusive prerogatives, exclusive powers, powers that would exclude others from cooperating. Even in the area of maintenance of peace and security, if you read the Charter carefully and if you follow the practice of the United Nations carefully, you would see that under Article 24, the UN Security Council, the body with the most formidable legal powers ever in history, created ever in history, does not have exclusive rights. The Charter speaks of primary responsibility. Now, primary means that there are others as well. And although primary may sound very ambitious, it is not exclusive. And I think that it is important to keep that in mind, because nowadays, in particular, UN has to work closely with a very wide variety of partners, not only member states, but also regional organizations who are becoming more and more important, a variety of actors that are not governments, and the inclusivity goes beyond state sovereignty. It goes into other areas, and in no area is the UN the only actor. Now, this, of course, is very important for the future of the UN, because the future of the UN will very much be about partnerships and working together. And, of course, in our discussion, we can come back to this notion in some more detail. The second reason for resilience of the United Nations is institutional stability. The founding fathers of the United Nations wanted and decided to create an organization which will not be easy to change, to change in the sense of fundamental revisions. If you look at the provisions on the revision of the UN Charter, you will see that it is very demanding to get 2/3 majority of votes for a decision and ratification of that revision, and also all permanent members of the Security Council with a positive vote on the decision, and of course ratification of the change. Now, this was deliberate because it was felt that the world needs a stable organization which will not be easily changed in fundamental sense in order to be able to adjust as the situation requires. Now, the third question, which is closely related to the second one, the third reason is something that I would call a reasonable capacity for reform. Now, UN is often criticized for not being very much reformable. It's not seen as an organization which is easy to reform, and sometimes described as reform resistant. But if one looks into the history of the UN, we'll see that much has changed and reforms did take place. I would like to submit for your reflection that reform does not only mean institutional change, not only expansion of the membership in the Security Council or the Economic and Social Council, but that the reforms imply, the concept of reform relates to at least 3 types of change. First is innovation, the second is adaptation, and the third is institutional change. And let me briefly relate to these 3 concepts of reform. UN has innovated a lot in the practice of the work of the Security Council. Of course, the early start was the peacekeeping, which was not an entirely novel idea at the time of the UN, but it was clearly seen as something that has to be developed and expanded. And now that was, obviously, Egypt was very closely related to that history, because UNEF I, the first important, the first really revolutionary peacekeeping operation was established precisely in this area. And one should never forget that that was an important innovation, which opened the door to many further innovations. And today, the UN has 110,000 peacekeepers around the world in 16 peacekeeping operations. And of course, peacekeeping has been changing all the time, has been evolving to levels which are really very new and very different. In the Congo, for example, these days, we find a concept of an international intervention brigade, which gives the peacekeeping operation powers to use force on its own initiative, which was not the case in earlier occasions, and of course which is going very far in the direction of collective security, authorizing states to come to the UN and initiate something that may be actually quite aggressive at times, but is fully legitimate under the terms of the UN Charter, as interpreted by the Security Council and as accepted by other members of the United Nations. So innovation was there to a typical feature of work of the Security Council, and I'm sure that those of you who follow the work of the Security Council more closely will have much to say. Egypt is now a member of the Security Council, so I'm sure that many people in this university and in the circles around the government have views on how innovation should look nowadays. The second type of reform is adaptation. Adaptation to the new needs and developments which are required by the changes in international environment. I don't wish to go in too deeply in my introduction into this, but I would like to say that if one looks the whole area of economic and social development, which is strongly represented in the UN Charter, there are quite many provisions about that, but not particularly strong powers. The Economic and Social Council does not have the power to impose binding decisions. It can produce recommendations, it can work with specialized agencies, it can do other things, but does not have a role of decision maker. Adaptation has been there all the time, and without going into history, let us think about adaptation which is taking place now at our time. As you know, in the past year, there were quite a few important documents adopted in the United Nations. First, the Sustainable Development Goals, which define the concept of development and the main tasks of development for the period between 2015 and 2030, an important document. Then the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing of Development. And finally, there was an important new agreement adopted in Paris on climate change. Now, these are all decisions which need to be implemented. And the question is, how should the UN adapt its policies and functioning to the new needs, which are defined in those fundamental documents? I would advise you to look into this evolution this year and next year with great care, because things are important and maybe we shall have important adaptations happening in this area. Just two examples, very brief examples from current practices. This month, the UN Statistical Commission will meet and will analyze its practice of providing indicators which help measuring social and economic progress. Now, as you know, over time, the UN Statistical Commission has become not only very valuable, but also very prestigious body, which is known for the objectivity of its statistical information and analysis. Obviously, this is not an easy task given the problems of availability and reliability of statistical data. Nevertheless, over time, the Statistical Commission was able to achieve a very significant level of credibility. It's consistently used by the economic decision makers within countries and internationally. And it is today in a particular situation in which it has to figure out how to develop the existing statistical methods to help measuring progress. It is interesting to see the documents that are being prepared for the Statistical Commission, and those documents will show us around 200 indicators that are already agreed to, and there will be another 100 more to be done this year and to help in devising policies in the future. Another adaptation which is taking place is related to the question how to ensure a sufficiently high-level representation of states in the future decision-making on development issues. And that, of course, includes both sustainable development in terms of environmental protection as much as social development in terms of social sustainability. Now, this, of course, is an important task, and ideas that are circulating right now include a suggestion that there should be a high-level political forum added to the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, and every 4 years to the General Assembly, to define the main policy objectives with a higher degree of political authority. Now, this sort of things were tried in the past when after Rio Conference the Rio Conference, as we know, took place in 1992. The following year, the UN established a special functional commission of ECOSOC, Commission on Sustainable Development, and it was expected that that commission will provide space for high-level policy dialogue. That unfortunately did not happen. And what we have seen was gradual drowning of the Commission on Sustainable Development in technicalities which the Commission could not manage. And now the question is UN going to be able to adapt to the new needs better with the kind of innovative approaches like the high-level policy forum? I believe that this is possible, but it will require very solid contribution, very solid inputs from various bodies of the UN system, including the Statistical Commission, and a very serious work by the UN Secretary General in formulating the agenda and also making sure that the quality of inputs is adequate. If that happens, the UN will be in a better position to advise on important policy issues related to development, to advise governments, to advise international institutions. And this is a role which I believe the history has brought to the UN and UN needs to perform. Now, will it perform it well? We shall see. But I remain optimist and I remain a believer in the UN, hoping that this will be the case. And the third type of reform, the institutional change, relates to something that we have seen in the area, on all areas of the UN. I will mention by way of example only one, and that is human rights, where 10 years ago the UN established Human Rights Council, which has a higher authority on human rights issues than its predecessor, the Commission for Human Rights. I was personally involved in that reform, and I can tell you that it is very interesting to witness or to be part of a process which demonstrates that the time for certain institutional change has arrived. The idea of a Human Rights Council is an old idea, and it was proposed in various academic circles back in the 60s and 70s, suggesting that human rights would require a body which would be at par with principal organs of the United Nations. In other words, with Security Council, with Economic and Social Council and Trusteeship Council. Now, that did not happen. The conditions were not ripe. But in 2005, the Secretary General Kofi Annan was asked to produce a report suggesting reforms. He prepared that report under the title We the Peoples, and he proposed in that report a three-council structure for the UN. In addition to Security Council and Economic and Social Council, he proposed that Human Rights Council. And the states accepted that idea. They couldn't change the charter for that purpose, but they did everything else and established a body which reports to the General Assembly, which has a higher authority than any predecessor, and which has produced something that is really quite interesting, namely the Universal Periodic Review, a methodology which allows all states, or which invites all states to report about their human rights situations and gives the Council the opportunity to advise. One important detail which was introduced in this context, we have discussed this in the Secretariat, was to make sure that states that are represented on the Security Council, on the Human Rights Council, that those states present their reports immediately upon election, that in the first year of their tenure they present their reports according to the principle that reviewers must be reviewed first. Well, that's an important detail, because in the past practice, we have seen a situation where two types of states emerged as far as human rights are concerned. Those who criticized and those who were criticized. Now, Kofi Annan wanted to change that to some extent, and of course, allow all states to be exposed to the same type of procedure. This may not look like a very important political change. It may also look very procedural, very technical, but in the UN, that has represented a significant change, and why it gives an answer to the question why one should consider the creation of the Human Rights Council an important body. And as you know, the current session of Human Rights Council has just started in Geneva, and the discussions have already become very lively. So I think it has a much more meaningful organ than was anything before. Now, I would like also to say a few words about the changing global landscape and global order. I have tried to indicate some of those changes by referring to issues of development, and I'm not going to repeat them now. Development, sustainable development, the creation of new bodies, and the work of the UN on recently agreed principles and other documents that were adopted in the years 2014 and 2015. So we have seen that as a part of the changing international order. Not yet very visible, but already significant. But then, when one talks about a changing international order, one always thinks about peace and security, because that's the core, that's the fundamental task of any order. It is to provide conditions for peaceful and secure development. And here we see disturbing situations, because the number of crises around the world is growing. The UN proved not to be able to find good solutions immediately. But the important thing is that the UN is there. If you take, for example, the case of Syria, we all have very good reasons to be disappointed and to be worried, because the crisis has been going for too long. It has created an enormous number of victims. It has created enormous exodus, and the level of suffering of Syrian people has become unbearable, and it has been unbearable for a long time. There were 3 envoys of the United Nations trying to help finding the solution. First Kofi Annan, after him Lakhdar Brahimi, and now Staffan de Mistura, with the authority of the Security Council and the Arab League. They have all seen how difficult it is to find a solution in a complex situation like the one in Syria, which involves a number of actors inside the country, in the region, and globally. So there are good reasons for concern, but there are also important reasons for supporting the United Nations, because the crisis in Syria and the war is one of those situations in which the UN is indispensable. It is only the UN that can convene credible peace talks, which are going to start in a few days in Geneva, or restart in a few days in Geneva. It is only the UN within the framework of which one can hope for a peaceful solution. It is only within the UN that documents like the Geneva Communique of 2012 and Vienna document of last year can be given a definitive legal importance, legal authority, through the Security Council Resolution 2254 and 2258, adopted in December last year. So UN, irrespective of its shortcomings, is an indispensable institution in the search for peace. And there is no other body that could be expected to have the kind of convening power that the UN has. It is worth reminding ourselves that in some earlier armed conflicts, this was not the case. In the case of war in Lebanon in the years 1975 to 1989, UN was not able to play a very strong role. There were discussions, of course, but the peace agreement was reached in Taif outside the United Nations. Later on, in the immediate post-Cold War period, the war in Bosnia, which started in 1992 and went on until 1995, had to be resolved through peace negotiations in Dayton, Ohio, at the initiative of the United States and with very limited role for the United Nations. So what I'm trying to say is that one has to look at these terrible situations in a balanced way. One has to understand the enormity of difficulties which characterize these processes, the fact that UN obviously could not always be the central place for negotiating peace, but that in fact, at our era, in the crisis of Syria, but I believe also in Libya in the future and possibly also with regard to Yemen, UN will retain its important, if not central role. What does this tell us? The changing landscape of global security contains worrisome elements, and we are now in a process of transition which is likely to change the global balance of power and global relations among the major powers generally. But then again, UN retains its central role and will, I'm sure, be a place where solutions will be not only sought, but also found. Now this, of course, I know is a daring hypothesis, but we are gathering in a university. And I think in universities we have to explore daring interpretations. I think I have spent my 30 minutes in discussing the United Nations, its resilience, its relevance in a changing global order. I have offered you a few points of departure for your own reflection and your own comments. I did not wish to go too much into detail of peacekeeping or development or human rights or any other aspect of work of the United Nations. But we have, in accordance with our program, like 45 minutes left, and we can perhaps explore these things in some more detail. I'm grateful for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.